Hi, this is Wanda from Alanda Craft, and in this tutorial we're going to be making a herringbone quilt. So let's get started. Now for the fabric you're going to need 4 main colours and some white fabric as a contrast. And as you can see we went with red, green, yellow and blue. Now for each of those colours you're going to need a light and a dark. So you can see here that we have a light and a dark green, a light and a dark blue, a light and a dark yellow, and a light and a dark red. So in other words, you're going to need 8 different fabrics and some white fabric. Now we have all of the cutting measurements on our website and there will be a link to that in the description field below. But basically what you need to cut are 5 squares that measure 8 by 8 from each of your coloured fabrics. So you'll have 40 squares in total. And then from your white fabric, you're going to cut 40 squares measuring 8 inches by 8 inches. You can see that we ended up using the Creative Grid Stripology ruler to speed up the process and get a more accurate cut. This was our first go at using this ruler, as we normally use the June Taylor version, so we thought it best to start with just 1 layer of fabric. And once we felt more confident, we moved on to cutting 3 layers, which really sped up the process. Okay, so we have all of our blocks cut into 8-inch squares. So now we have 40 coloured squares and 40 white squares. Now before we get into putting the quilt together, I'd like to mention Craftsy, the sponsor of today's video. Craftsy is an online resource with more than 2,000 creative craft classes, including quilting, sewing, knitting, crochet, cooking and more. Now each course has detailed course notes and step-by-step videos taught by professional instructors, some of whom you may even recognise. Now we've previously taken Craftsy classes in sewing, knitting, applique, and we even tackled a couple of cooking classes. One of our favourite classes is the stupendous stitching course. This was a lot of fun and you can see the bag that we created here. So if you think you might like to try out Craftsy, use our link in the description field below and the first 1,000 people to use that link will get 1 full year of premium membership for just $1.49. Okay, so now let's get on with finishing the quilt. And now what we're going to do is to make some half square triangles. So I'm going to start by taking one of the coloured squares and I'll place it down on the mat with the right side facing up. And then I'm going to take a white square and I'm going to place it on top of the other square with the right sides facing down. I'll make sure everything lines up nicely and I'll take a ruler and draw a diagonal line across the square with my friction pen, which will vanish when I iron the fabric. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew 1/4 inch down one side of that line and 1/4 inch down the other side. You can see here that I've sewn on both sides of that line and I'll just flip it over so that you can see it a little better. And now what I'm going to do is place my ruler along the drawn line and I'll cut along that line with my rotary cutter. And now when I open these pieces up you'll see that we have 2 half square triangles. And I'm just going to repeat this process with the rest of the squares. So now we have all of our half square triangles and what we're going to do is press them and I'll quickly show you how I do that. So I want the seams to be pressed to the dark side of the fabric, and to do that I have the dark fabric facing up and then I run my iron along the seam to set it. Then I open up the half square triangle and just run the iron along that seam so that it sits facing the dark fabric, and you can see that here. I've pressed all of my half square triangles to the dark side, and that is to ensure that the seam line is less obvious than if we were to iron it towards the white fabric. The next thing that I need to do is trim the blocks back to 7.5 inches by 7.5 inches. And the reason we're doing that is because the blocks aren't perfectly sized, and when you sew pieces of fabric together you get slight stretching and movement, so we need to trim the blocks so that they are all the same size. And if you don't know how to trim half square triangles, you can take a look at our video tutorial on how to do that. Just check for the link in the description field below this video. Once you've trimmed back all of your half square triangles, it's time to lay them out, and you can see here how we have coordinated the colours so that the yellows are in one column, the reds in another, and so on. Now I'm going to sew the squares together and I'm going to sew them with a 1/4 inch seam. And I will sew them into lots of 2 to start with and then sew the whole row together. I find that's easier to work with. And once the row is done, I'll continue up the quilt sewing each of the rows in turn. So I've sewn all my squares into rows, and now what we need to do is join the rows. But before I do that, I'll show you how I iron the seams. So I've just flipped over the first 3 rows. You can see that in the first row I've ironed the seams in one direction this way, and on the next row I've ironed the seams in the opposite direction. On the third row they run back the other way again. And I've done that all the way up the quilt, alternating the direction of the seams for each row. Now when we get ready to sew the first 2 rows together, you'll see why we press the seams the way we did. The seams nest perfectly together, which means that all of the seam lines will line up nice and even. And what I'm going to do is pin along each of these joins first, and then I'll pin along the rest of the row. And we'll sew along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam, and I'll continue joining all the rows together to form my quilt top. And there you have it. Our half square triangle herringbone quilt is complete. At this point you could always add a border, or you could potentially add more blocks if you want a bigger quilt. I'm just going to add batting and backing and finish the quilt with binding. And we have a tutorial on how to machine bind a quilt, and I'll add that link to the description field below. So thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. And I'll catch you next time.